Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Nadine Heidinger, and I'm the Director of Communications at the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, we host over 150 free programs, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. To find out more about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org, or you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. On behalf of our literary committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event featuring crime writer and artist Jonathan Santlofer. He is the author of 6 novels, including Anatomy of Fear and international bestseller, The Death's Artist, both of which combine his talents to create page-turners featuring original illustrations. He is also the author of his poignant memoir, The Widower's Notebook, which was a Publishers Weekly's Best Book of 2018. His most recent novel uses the real-life theft of the Mona Lisa from the Louvre in 1911 as the premise of a clever, twisty mystery. Sandloffer appears in conversation with the prolific and award-winning author Joyce Carol Oates. Her 58th novel, Breathe, was inspired by the 2019 death of her second husband. The New York Times called the book a fever dream of a novel, and it's as an allegory of grief that it most sparkles, something that many can recognize only too well. Tonight's featured books can be purchased from our preferred independent bookseller, Books on Call, at a discount, and we'll be sharing the link in the chat during the conversation. Following the conversation will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function for any questions you might have. And without further ado, let me introduce Jonathan and Joyce. Please enjoy the conversation.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Well, we're focusing on Jonathan's novel tonight. And I'm not really seeing this on my own screen.
I saw it. Thank you, Joyce.
Okay. I see you, but I don't see myself.
I see you. I see the book. It's all good. Luckily, Joyce has a book because I don't. I'm not at home. And so good. You're more prepared, Joyce.
Okay.
Do you hear me?
Yeah, I'm having a little trouble. I'm so sorry.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Well,
I'm sorry. Everything has just sort of gone wrong.
Really? Oh. I see you perfectly and I hear you perfectly. If you hear me.
Well, I will just, I can't really see anything, but I'm just going to continue. So, Jonathan, I just wanted to ask to sort of start our conversation. You are an artist and a very accomplished artist. Have you ever written a book-length work of fiction that was not related to art?
That's a good question because, you know, the funny thing is that I don't think of my books really as being art novels. And yet, of course, I mean, The Last Mona Lisa is all about, you know, art and the theft of the Mona Lisa, though somehow in my mind, you know, if I set out to write a book about art specifically, I don't know what it would be. You know, I've written monographs on artists, and a few years ago, I wrote about a German photographer, and I went there, and those were very specifically about art. But I think of my novels as somehow, I guess, you know, because art's been so important to me in my life, but I think I just think of it as yet another part of it. Joyce, it's like, I was thinking the other day, and I'm sure you think this, or not that you think this, but that you experience this, that all writing is writing. There's genre writing, and we've both written memoirs and grief memoirs. And yes, they're extremely different kinds of books, but in terms of writing a book, I'm getting away from your question, but it's something I've been thinking about, how it's sort of like, okay, when I make a painting or I make a drawing, it's about mark making. I used to tell my drawing students, if we're drawing a portrait, until you forget that you're drawing a nose, you will not be able to draw it. So you have to sort of look at this thing as a bunch of marks. And it's the way I look at a book, as words and sentences. And so I do know that obviously I've been interested in art my whole life. And I think one of my favorite things that somebody ever said about The Last Mona Lisa was that the things when I wrote about art were just as exciting as the thriller aspect. So I loved that. But when you're writing, and you've written suspense novels, romance novels, I would say sort of, memoir for sure. I think about Blonde as a kind of non-biography, so do you change the way, I'm turning this around, I know, but do you change the way you write, or do you just embody that book? That makes sense?
Well, virtually everything I write is sort of experimental. So if it seems as if I'm writing a realistic novel, it's sort of, I hope you can't hear this.
I hear you perfectly.
There's a telephone ringing. Oh. I'm sorry about that. But I think of all writing as experimental. So if we're writing, say, a realistic novel, we want to give the impression of a realistic novel. It's rather like the impression on the reader. But very specifically in your writing, because you do have the artistic side, the visual side of your brain is very developed. You may not be aware that there is this component to your writing that may be a little different from others. I try to have a strong visual component in my writing, and so did John Updike, who studied art. But there are writers like Virginia Woolf and Henry James and Beckett and some others in which there's virtually no visual component.
That's true.
You almost don't know. You don't know what anybody looks like. There isn't a physical sense. Then there are writers like Charles Dickens, very famously, and Thomas Hardy and D.H. Lawrence, and to some extent Faulkner. Faulkner has maybe a combination of both, and they're very visual. And Nabokov, and they're kind of summoning up an almost hallucinatory world that we can step into. So that's what interests me in my writing, to conjure up a hallucinatory but sort of vivid and tactile and visceral world so that I can step into it and I can inhabit it.
Right. Well, I don't feel that differently about it. It's interesting that all of the writers you mentioned, I think about the writers I was first drawn to when I was very young. Dickens, who I still love, and those are some of my favorite books. D.H. Lawrence, Nabokov, and they were very visual writers. For me, when I'm writing, I have to see it, and I'm inhabiting that world, and I need to go walk through that scene in that world. Otherwise, it's like I'm making it up, which is odd because, of course, we are making it up, but it can't feel like that somehow,
Well, you're such a 20th century artist because you talk about the painting being lines and shapes. And I find that eerie and uncanny. Most of us don't think that way. If you're drawing a little donkey, it seems like you're drawing a donkey, but you would say, no, you're putting marks down on a canvas.
Here's what I would say.
Oh.
You may be drawing the donkey, you may be drawing the face and the nose, but to be able to do that, you need to be able to figure out the marks that make,
I know.
I mean, I taught drawing and painting for years, so I know that, but I feel that, that idea of a fever dream, which was described for your book, Breathe, I think is true for many of your books. I mean, I think Blonde is a kind of fever dream as well. But I know that because right now I'm in the middle of writing a book, and it is like a fever dream to me. In fact, I periodically want to get up and take like 20 aspirin because my head's exploding, from being inside this thing so deeply.
And that's good, because if that isn't, if you're not entranced by it, then it's probably not really working.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny with the last Mona Lisa, because it's a book, that was a book that I worked on for quite a long time. I started it, I put it away, I took it out.
How long did you work on it?
Oh, I'm embarrassed to say, because I started it a dozen years ago, but then I put it aside. I wrote 100 pages and I really liked it, but things happened and then I put it away, and then I took it out, and then there was some tragic events in my life and I somehow couldn't work on that book. But I probably worked on it for a few years as a sort of solid thing. But, now I think it must be like all pain. I remember that book as pleasurable, as opposed to right now when I'm writing and I want to jump out the window half the time. But I do, one of the great things for that book, and it was trying to not only live in that world, of the present and the past and Florence and Paris, and but making that all work. I don't know. I mean, I'm doing it again, so I guess it's not so different. I don't know why each book feels like, but I used to say this when I was a really serious painter, that every time I started a painting, it felt like I was relearning the whole thing somehow.
Well, in the last Mona Lisa, you're working with a historical figure, Leonardo, and some others, and you have these wonderful drawings. Oops. So.
Well, I'll tell you, Joyce, yes, that's a Leonardo self-portrait that I copied.
But we should explain what this is.
Joyce is showing you little drawings I made. I made, I do this for almost every book.
Oh, you do?
I do. I make artwork because when I can't write or when I need a break. So with Leonardo, I wanted to understand him. And it was when I made his self-portrait, he was left-handed. So it was very difficult for me because all of his strokes go in the opposite direction of the way my hand would work.
I saw that. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
But what I'm getting, trying to ask you is that in this novel, there are his historical figures like Leonardo, but in your novel now, do you have, is there historical artists?
Yes. Yes.
Who is it?
Can I just say that one of the things that I actually loved, I always love my research, and then I have to sort of remember it and then use some of it and throw a lot of it away. So, so it doesn't overwhelm the book. But I read Walter Isaacson's great Leonardo biography. It's like 700 pages. And I loved mixing fact and fiction. And you've done that because you take many of your books come out of real events, we were talking about it last week, the Chappaquiddick book that you wrote, which is a novella, Dark Water, Black Water.
Blackwater.
Blackwater. And that how you change. I keep answering my questions talking about your books, don't I? Well, that's all right. I have a lot of them in my head, you know. But historical figures, I think, Joyce, you know this, or let's say real figures, are for me are a great touchstone. But then I have to play between. I have to give up what is. I will always, in the end, choose what's happening in my book, in the world of my book, over the reality of something. Though I'm not going to present a lie, you know, there's lots of information about Leonardo, but he's in the past. Or, you know, the thief who stole the Mona Lisa, his story goes back and forth in the past because his great grandson is there to, you know, find out the truth. In any case,
but what are you writing now?
Okay. Well, I wasn't going to really say.
Is Leonardo in the new novel?
No.
No. So do you have any comparable artists?
Yeah, I'll show you what I'm reading. Hang on. Okay. Can you see that?
Oh, Van Gogh.
This is a great biography, actually, by Stephen Knife and Gregory White Smith, who did the Jackson Pollock biography.
Wow.
And all I will say is that Van Gogh, or as my Dutch friends corrected me to, not Van Gogh, but Van Gogh.
Who knew?
It's a lot of phlegm. He plays a role in the past in my book. And, you know, it's funny because as somebody who has been an artist and been involved in that world, though I admired and loved many Van Gogh paintings, he was not an artist, you know, like he is to the world for me. And now he has become, he's living inside me in this insane way. You know,
he's so mesmerizing.
Oh, he really, I mean, I just because I'm using him in a certain way in the book, and you know, that happens. It happens to you too. I mean, we fall into these worlds and into these lives and of course, you know, Leonardo was incredible. You know, he was one of the 5 great high Renaissance artists, and I loved learning about him. I used very little, actually, when I wrote the book.
But his work is so much more cerebral. Van Gogh is so obviously enthralled to the unconscious. I mean, the brush strokes, and it's so different from Leonardo. Totally.
Well, you know, Van Gogh, if you look at art history, you know, so there's Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, and Impressionism, which is all optical mixing and dabs of color.
Yeah.
And Van Gogh was very influenced when he came to Paris and lived with his brother Theo for 2 years. But, you know, you have this group of artists, Cézanne, who takes of Impressionism and makes something very structured, and Gauguin, who's about color and symbolism, really. And then Van Gogh, who is all emotion. You know,
I've seen exhibits where the last paintings he did of his life, you know, the one with all the crows and the field and so forth, and you can sort of see this powerful unconscious sort of rising up, and one has the feeling that he's rapidly painting, that it's just very feverish. We don't feel that way about Leonardo.
No, we don't.
Caravaggio. They seem much more controlled. And
it's true, although Caravaggio had a very short life.
Yeah.
You know, Leonardo lived to a ripe old age. And in fact, you know, the Mona Lisa, which is fascinating, is that it was a commission, and he never gave it to them. So I always wondered, because I do commission paintings, like, did he give them the money back? You know, he took the commission.
Yeah, I wonder.
He needed the money. And then he didn't need the money, and he had that painting. He took it with him everywhere he went, really. It was with him when he died. And that's how it ended up at the Louvre, because he was living in d'Amboise in France, and that painting went into the French courts, and then Napoleon had it on his bedroom wall, and then it ended up in the Louvre. And then the theft of the Mona Lisa is actually what catapulted its fame, made it into this iconic painting.
Yes, it's so interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think everybody really loved the way you mix the historical and the actual with ficticious characters.
I went to see the Mona Lisa again just a few weeks ago, and I had when I wrote the last Mona Lisa, I had a special visit where I got to see it by myself, where it is now. And then this time I wanted to see it because I wanted to see it the way most people see it. And so I waited on this enormous line in the Louvre that moves. And, and then you get up to the front. And I know a lot of people are disappointed because it's quite small. But they didn't usher you out. I stood there for at least 20 minutes. And I still think that it is a beautiful, mesmerizing little painting,
That's why Leonardo kept it. That's why he didn't give it to his patron. He kept it.
I mean, I think there were many reasons.
Maybe he was in love with it.
He was a very complicated man. I mean, Van Gogh was certainly complicated in a different way. And, you say painting so fast. He lived, and I just was here, in Auvers-sur-Oise, which is a town north of Paris, very close, takes you about an hour less to get there. And it's where Van Gogh lived the last 70 days of his life. And he painted 80 paintings in 70 days.
Just astonishing. Some of those paintings are, all of those paintings are just so powerful.
Yeah, they are.
Oh.
They are.
Are you writing also about Theo?
A little bit. I mean, I go back to the past, and my backstory, like in the last Mona Lisa, influences the contemporary story, the front story. And Joyce, so you've done this too, haven't you? I know you have. We've talked about it, where you're writing something and you're writing quite a lot of it, and then somehow something you get knocked out of that book. That happened with this book that I'm working on. I mean, I literally threw away 100 pages. Well, I didn't throw them away. They're living on my computer, but, I don't know.
Is this a sequel in the sense that it's about Luke? Is it still?
Yeah, Luke is back. I didn't expect Luke to be back, but I kind of, Luke is back. Luke Peroni is back. And everybody always asks me if I'm Luke. Well, first of all, Luke is 36 years old. And unless I am in really good light, I'm not going to pass for that.
Wasn't he Catholic? Was he Catholic?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not Catholic at all.
Really? Gosh, I don't know. I don't know what to say to that. But plus, by the way, I don't know, Luke came full blown to me in some ways. And I mean, he built on, as you live with a character, they change. But physically and in so many ways, he's not like me, although he did go to art school and he was a troubled bad boy. I wasn't exactly a bad boy, but I would say that I had trouble until I got to art school. I was not.
He tends to be anxious and he frets.
Yeah.
So are you like that?
Joyce. I mean, Joyce knows the answer to this question, everyone, that indeed I do fret, and I am not the very cool customer I pretend to be, which I'm not doing a good job of, am I? But
well, let me ask a couple other questions I think will be of interest to listeners. This Chaudron, was Chaudron an actual historical forger?
Yes. So in the novel, what Joyce is referring to is that there is an art forger named Yves Chaudron, a French painter. And what is believed is that he actually, when the Mona Lisa was stolen and it was missing for 2 years, actually, I just want to diverge for a second to say my favorite fact about the theft of the Mona Lisa is that nobody in the Louvre noticed it was missing for 2 days. You know, which shows you that it was not the most important painting in the world at the time.
Oh, wonderful.
So it was missing for 2 years, and during that time, it was, some people believe, that this man, Yves Chaudrin, made 6 or 8 copies of the Mona Lisa, which they sold as each one as the original. And that idea, I read about that, stuck in my head. And as Joyce knows, I make forgeries for people. That is replications of paintings. So when I wrote the scenes, I went back into the past to write the scenes of that forger. I could really be inside his head. I knew it. I know what it feels like. I know that what it's like to inhabit another artist, to try and create their work. So he's a real person. So is the Marquis, who is the salesman. De Valfiero, he was a real person. They both disappeared mysteriously, by the way.
Well, since it's a thriller, we know what happened to them.
Oh, well.
Something terrible happened to them. Well, a little more about forgery. The kind of paintings that you do that are commissioned are replicas or copies. Are they actually forgeries?
No, they're not forgeries. They're not. Because to make a forgery, I would be trying to pass it off as the real thing. I mean, people ask me to make replications. The way it started for me was that a man who was bidding on a Franz Klein painting, he dropped out after, I don't know, $20 million at the time. And he asked me if I would make a replication of that painting for him, which I did.
But you made it a little different.
Well, what I did with mine, because it was going into an atrium of a financial firm, so it was going to be seen by the public, is I made the painting in mirror image. And he said people would come in and say, "Oh, you bought the painting." And he was very honest. I'd say to people, "No, mine is newer and cleaner."
Of course. Well, where was your name?
Well, my name was on the back. I also had buried my initials in the front. There are rules about what you need to do when you're making a copy.
Are these federal laws or are they international laws?
I don't know if I think they have been codified, because there've been lawsuits. David Sally, the artist, was sued over using other imagery. And so these things have become, over the years, more and more sort of codified. Like, you have to either change the medium or the size, you have to, give credit, or you have to sign somewhere. I loved writing about an art forger, though, as a character.
Did Franz Klein have a signature characteristically on?
I'm sure he did not. I'm not sure. I don't think he ever signed the front.
Did you ever do a de Kooning?
De Kooning did sign his paintings, and I've made several de Kooning forgeries, so I know how to write his signature very well.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Several de Koonings. Did you ever do a Rothko?
I did. I did an early Rothko for a collector.
Is that hard to do?
It was very difficult, but what I try and do is, what I tried to do with that painting is use some of Rothko's actual techniques. So I rubbed raw pigment into the surface, and it's always an experience. I don't do many of them, Joyce. You know that. I mean, maybe 1 or 2 a year, because.
Well, we don't know. We don't really know. I mean, we may be doing a lot of them, but you would never do a living right of.
No,
like Jasper.
No, that feels totally wrong to me.
What about Pollock? You haven't done Pollock, have you?
No, but there is an artist, what is his name, who has done copies of Pollock drip paintings for years. I can't think of his name at the moment. No, I haven't done any. I don't really want to do a Pollock. I don't want to drive myself crazy, crazier.
It would be very interesting to do. But the first question I asked you is really about sort of the artistic and the visual elements in your writing. And so I have other books of yours, and I mean, not to embarrass you or shock you, but It's the Killing Art.
I hate that cover. Oof. Yes, go on. Yes.
Well, here we have somebody who's not a forger, but he's
That's Anatomy of Fear, right? Yes. Anatomy of Fear.
this is the Killing Art.
No. No.
Oh,
Something.
Anatomy of Fear.
Anyhow, Anatomy of Fear.
Is this something at the back of the book? I see. So, but I wanted to ask you because you have, unlike anyone I know, you have so much visual illustrations in your novels. I mean, there's a whole other dimension where and it's true in your memoir too, that you have this other dimension. Now it's not replicated very well because this is a paperback. So,
well, I just realized that what they did in the paperback is that they put a teaser for the next book.
Oh yeah, that's
Anatomy
right.
of Fear.
That's
and,
right.
Yeah.
I was wondering because it just ends so abruptly.
It's very odd.
But in the Killing Art, you have the replications of the works of art that are vandalized. So this person, it's not that he's a forger, but it's some of the same impulses and aggressive, violent impulses. Like the forger is doing something that always is violent, as a kind of appropriation. And the Chaudron said that he just went into the Louvre and sat there with his easel and just copied something.
Right.
I mean, have you done that?
No, I never went into a museum to make a copy. I mean, what I've done before I make a painting, for example, when I knew I was about to make a de Kooning, I went and saw a lot of de Koonings and I took pictures, mainly details, so I could see what his brushstrokes when I made the painting. Although, of course, it's very odd to be making an abstract expressionist painting that's made out of emotion, and I'm painting it like this because I'm faking all the emotion, you see.
Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it? You're like an actor. You're an actor.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you say that, because I said to somebody that when I'm making a copy, I feel like I'm a method actor falling inside of this other artist's head. But don't you feel that when you're writing, in some ways, that I know that when you talk about experimental, and I understand that, in your books and what so many things that you're looking at about, let's say, exploring genre or language, or how that, how you make a collage, or I'd say a montage of a book with something like The American Martyrs. That book, you get all of these different characters at once, which I always find astonishing because it's a kind of juggling act. Do you feel that at all when you're doing let's say a big book like that?
Well, you can look upon writing in different ways. And one way to look upon writing is that it's like dramatizing. So there is an act that's like an event, and you try to evoke it from different perspectives of the people who are in it. It's not necessarily that you're writing about a particular character, but you're evoking an event. I was reading about the explosion of the Hindenburg in 1937 in Lakehurst, New Jersey. I'm not going to write about that, but it's going to touch upon something that I am writing about, just a historical event. But say you wanted to write about the explosion of the Hindenburg in 1937. Well, it's something that actually happened. So it's literally an event that could be like a movie. So one way of approaching it is trying to evoke the dramatic experience of being in that time period. It burned and crashed in less than 1 minute. And like 16 seconds, it was 400 feet above the earth, and then it it crashed. Everything happened very, very quickly. So, I mean, there are ways of writing about things that are like past tense. Once upon a time, this happened and this happened.
Mhm.
But then there's another way of writing that's a historical present. So you're evoking something happening right now. And so
Yeah.
it's a little more like a movie. So I'm sort of interested in evoking things that seem to be happening right now, where we haven't put any stamp or any interpretation on them. So we
Mhm.
don't exactly know what's happening.
Right. Well, I mean, I think well, I not only agree, I mean, the way the last Mona Lisa starts is you're in the head of the thief and he is walking through the museum and he's
Right.
stealing the painting. And to me, that was absolutely a movie. It's in the moment. It's not in the past. It's happening now. And I think that's, I think something I probably learned from reading so many of your books over time. What I loved about them was that they are happening, even if it's a historical book or something about the past. Everything is happening now because that's how you make it come to life. That's how we bring the reader into that world with us.
And it's how we live too. We live our lives in time, and we look back sometimes. But when we're looking back, we have a sort of revisionist view. True. We slide or we reduce or we summarize, but it actually wasn't that right. Simple. So I really think that many of our lives are past a kind of amnesia, that we actually don't even know what we felt, and we might not have, like, you could look back on your life and say, oh my God, I was actually so happy. I was very happy for those years, but I didn't know it because I was so stressed and so consumed with my career, or I never knew, or there was some health issues. But it's only when something's over with, you can look back and say, well, this was a placid time. This was a happy time, but I didn't really know it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I felt that I'm trying to think of the stories that you wrote. It's not that long ago, but they're stories that feel like they're from your life and from your, marriage to Charlie. And if you don't mind me bringing that up, and I related to that in so many ways. And we both talked about our memoirs publicly too, and how, yeah, it's very interesting to be writing a grief memoir and to be experiencing parts of it as happy, extremely happy moments in your life without, I mean, there's always I don't know, I'm sort of thinking about how when I looked back at that book, as I was writing it, I would try and distance myself. It was very difficult, but I just knew I didn't want to bury it in grief totally, that experience is there.
It's very funny. There are a lot of very funny, black humor and ironic things in your memoir, more than in mine.
Well, I didn't know that until afterward, when I didn't, Joyce. I know you don't believe me, but I did. When people wrote that about the book or told me that, then I went back and I was like, oh yeah, I see. This is so ridiculous, but I didn't think of it as ever being funny, but of course life is absurd and often funny at the worst times,
Well, I think when you lose somebody very close to you, that aftermath of about 3 months, 4 or 5 months, is just fraught with such a sense of the absurd. I mean, things happen that seem inappropriate. There isn't the high elevated language of King Lear. It's more like Groucho Marx. It's slapstick, and that is sort of shocking, so that you express it maybe in a kind of dark humor.
Yeah, I mean, I think of those actually of those grief periods as so surreal because you're not sleeping and you're not connecting to the world in a way, writing about it, and trying to give the sense. I think I maybe told you this, that when the first drafts of my memoir, yours, which is written in those small segments of time and specificity, when I wrote mine, it was all over the place because I didn't want to change it because I wanted it to feel like how I experienced it. And my editor said, the reader won't be able to feel that. I just want you to put this into chronological order. And I fought the idea. Now when I never read it, but I think she was right to do that, so that the reader could experience. They couldn't experience the other way, But,
well, mine was a little different from yours because it was worked up from a journal. Whereas you went away, I think you went to Yaddo and were recollecting. Whereas
I did have notes, though. I literally did have notes and notebooks. So it's similar, I guess. I don't know. Yeah.
I think there's such a sense of wonderment as we could look back on our lives and you sort of see this person going through the motions of something that's going to turn out to be tragic, but not knowing, like the hour before. I mean, there's just something about the whole experience that's ineffable. It's you can't really write about it. You can maybe put it in a movie, but to find the language is just very, very difficult.
It is. I think just to sideways of that you and I and Megan Abbott, like a week ago at the Montclair Book Festival, we were talking about the whole thing of putting emotion and ideas into language and the difficulty of that. And how I was thinking today, because I had an absolutely terrible writing day. Nothing I wrote, everything felt false, and I'm not going to use any of it. Yesterday, it just was there. So, my brain was able to take things that I'm thinking about and put them into language. Today, they couldn't for some reason.
Do you have the same structure that you did for the Mona Lisa, where you have shifting perspectives from different chapters?
Yes, perhaps a little less, but, I've grown to like that.
Three or four? Do you have like 3 or 4?
Yeah, I think also that seeing things as we do in the world from different people's points of view is really, to me, very interesting, rather than a straightforward narrative, which I would like to do a totally straightforward narrative. I think it would be easier, but for some reason I keep getting pulled into these multiple narratives,
Well, have you written anything that was from one perspective?
Probably. I can't remember if I did. I mean, I'm sure I did,
It's the structure of the thriller. The thriller in contrast to the mystery detective. The mystery detective, the perspective is usually the detective, like it's sort of a fixed perspective. And we're moving through time and space through the eyes of this person who's like the investigator, he's the explorer.
Yeah.
We don't know any more than he knows, but we tend to know less than he knows. Now, with the thriller, you're moving like a movie, like you have your character here, but then you go to your villain who's waiting down the street with a gun to kill him. And then you go to somebody else and you go to a shopkeeper. You have like, these are different scenes in a movie, but that genre is actually very, very different from the mystery or detective genre.
Yeah, I think point of view is something that fascinates me. Also, what you just said about the mystery genre, that the reader knows less.
A little less. Yeah.
For me, what is exciting in writing a book is letting particularly if it's a thriller like The Last Mona Lisa, the one I'm working on, The reader actually knows more than the characters.
The reader, yeah. The reader knows more.
Yeah. And to me, that is a movie. It's a filmic device. It's Hitchcock. It's what Hitchcock did. You know, you have two characters sitting at a table and they're talking in a totally ordinary, banal way, but there's a bomb under the table. And so the people watching, the audience,
Right.
everything's heightened because they see that. And that is something I like, having my reader know more than the characters, so that you can only do that with shifting points of view.
Yes, and it's an experiment. Like,
yeah.
I wouldn't naturally be writing that way, but I've tried to do it. And my next novel, Babysitter, is a little bit like that, where it's in the historical present. So I'm moving around. So characters in any particular chapter know less than the reader knows. But in an Earl Stanley Gardner, Nero Wolfe novel, you always know less than the character.
Babysitter, I had just started it. Can you show the cover? Just your newest, but it's not out yet, is it?
It's not out yet.
No, but I had just started it, and then I left it home before I came up here. So I was noticing that you were writing in these small, and is it different characters in this community? And because there are these murders that are going on.
Well, there are probably about three major perspectives that are different, and then there are choral voices, like voices of the victims. The babysitter was a serial killer in Detroit in 1977. So the voices of his victims, but they don't necessarily have any names, and they're all different. So they're in italics.
Right. Yeah.
But to me, the idea of writing is exciting because I want to do something different, where the voice is different and the chapters have some different relationship. So if I were just to write the way I wrote, say, the last novel that I did, it wouldn't be of any interest to me because I want to do something different. So I have a story. I mean, we all have stories. You could do an outline, but that's really not what's interesting. It's the presentation of it.
Right. Well, I agree with you. I mean, every book seems to change for me in some way, and I think it's because I have to be interested in what I'm writing. Otherwise, and I always felt that way about my paintings, which always changed, which is difficult sometimes for your, let's say, your audience. But I have to be interested or excited as you do when you write. Otherwise, I don't know why anybody would be interested enough or excited enough to read what I did or look at what I do, you know?
Yeah, and I think that what writing becomes more difficult, maybe art also, well, like Philip Guston, you sort of reach a zenith of something that you're doing very beautifully and perfectly, and everybody loves it. Though that's not necessarily the case with writers, but Philip Guston.
Yeah.
And then, you think, well, am I going to live the next 20 years of my life just doing this again? So sort of taking a hard right turn or a hard left turn and doing something so totally different that it's actually like shocking.
Right. Well, he did. And of course, now everybody likes those later paintings, the second phase of Guston's life, much more than they do the first. But I think...
well, I don't. I have to just say parenthetically, I just find the Ku Klux Klan, I don't know what to think about.
Well, those paintings are tough. They're cartoonish. They're clunky. I think they're really...
Well, I think he identified. He wasn't ridiculing the Klan. He was sort of identifying as if he was a Klan.
Well, that's a whole other topic. But I do think that
it's
what
very
I respect is an artist tossing away an entire career. You know?
Well, it's behind him. He didn't toss it away. I mean,
yes, but what I mean, you do though, because your audience feels very betrayed if you're that kind of, like Guston was part of, abstract expressionism. He did a certain kind of predictable color painting.
Right.
He gave up his audience. I mean, they were furious at him.
Well, I know, but the paintings still existed.
Yeah, paintings still exist. It's true. It's true.
Do you think he's like Helen Frankenthal, or are they quite different?
Oh, I think they're very different. Yeah, I think they're very different.
Really?
Much more, it was always a more lyrical, color stain, painting about beauty in some ways, so.
You have a wonderful quote from Clifford Still. I'll see if I can find it. Clifford Still, he was, what a nasty person he was.
A nasty guy, Clifford Still, apparently.
Here in New York is where the showdown fight goes on. It's bloody and real. No illusion about social morality, high or low. The artist is his brother's enemy like nowhere else. New York is a slash across the belly. You know your friend has a knife and will use it on you. Wow.
I found that quote and I was reading, and I used it as, yes, for that book, because that's kind of what that book is about, sort of the and the intensity. That The Killing Art was based on a true story as well.
Oh, really?
The artists in the 50s and what had happened, this exclusivity and this thing they determined. And then I took it and went someplace else, from that true story. So,
well, he wasn't vandalizing art, though, was he?
No.
But
no.
New York is a slash across the belly.
Kind of amazing line, though, right?
His work is very kind of classic and very cerebral, and it's very powerful. But he wanted these huge canvases so that he would sort of dominate the wall.
Yeah, it feels like that. I mean, these jagged stalactites. Yeah.
I think is in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where there's a special room, and it can only be Clifford Stills in that room. It's just this huge, it's all him.
Right.
He doesn't have to share it with anybody else.
Talk about controlling your future, right? How people see you. But I don't know. I mean, yeah. Anyway, I feel Clifford Still's not my favorite painter, but I think he did some interesting things. And I do think it's interesting to, that the sort of, I had been interviewing artists for an article I was writing, and that's how that book came about, because they all told me the same story, and of this horrible event and this competitiveness. And I thought, wow, what if somebody was so angry or so excluded that they lashed out and really did slash someone across the belly. So,
well, if I were an artist, like a serious artist, I think I would just feel so stunned and bewildered at the kind of art that's extremely successful, like Jeff Koons. I because it seems like a parody. I guess
I could give you the whole history, Dada, pop.
I know.
It doesn't mean that I'm going to like it, or doesn't mean I'll like it or support it, but I can give you the art historical context, whether or not that makes sense. So anyhow, I wonder if there are questions for us, probably for you, Joyce, right?
But just for 1 second,
yeah.
I think you went to the Whitney exhibit, the Andy Warhol exhibit, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, when you actually see his work up on the wall, the early work and moving into what he did later, you can see how a bright young artist had to do something totally different from the abstract expressionists. Yeah. Like, he couldn't possibly be a little footnote to them. He had to do something completely different. So that makes sense. So it's a kind of meta art. It's almost like it's a parodistic kind of Duchampian art that he's doing. But if you were a different kind of artist, like an artist of beauty, like Rothko, then you would just feel, I think, this bewilderment. Like, why would parody art or ugly art be worth like $50 million. And what I'm doing, or say Wolf Kahn, who's working on art. But I understand that most people are not interested in this, but I'm just trying to express that the living artist must feel a bewilderment at the kind of art that the marketplace is rewarding.
I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I think that each generation of artists, there's Robert Rauschenberg's famous Erasing de Kooning's Mind, which I think is so symbolic as an act of truth. First of all, it's acknowledging who your great father was as an artist, and then you are erasing them for the next generation. And I think people do that. Visual art is a particular thing because we see it and we are supposed to understand it immediately, but it's got a whole language like we do in writing. I remember Picasso in an interview, they were attacking him for cubism, and he said, it's a new language about 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. And he said, I don't speak whatever he said, I think Russian. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So there are ongoing languages in visual art, in writing, things that change, as we know. You mentioned Henry James. That I love Henry James, and I feel like I grew up on him. But I can't imagine that anyone would publish Henry James as a young writer now.
But writing is a little different in that they're different. Yeah. It's more like different rivers that are parallel. The art seems to evolve in a way that's almost tyrannical. Like there's the New York art scene. It has a centrality. Whereas with when, say, Donald Barthelme and John Barth and Bob Coover and Nabokov were writing in the 1950s or so, at the same time, we still had a very solid and very highly regarded literature realism, like social realism, or psychological realism, or writing that women or persons of color are doing. So you have experimental work over here, but you have the solid realism that continues. So I think being with literature, we're not dispossessed by the latest thing that comes along, whereas in art
yes and no. I would use as an example my very old friend Catherine Murphy, who is one of, I think, the great painters of her time and our time. And she's a very realistic artist. But her work, if you see it, I wish we could flip pictures.
Portraits of women, portraits.
She does all kinds of things, but her paintings make acknowledgement to minimalism, conceptualism. They're brilliantly conceived paintings, like a hose on the ground is like a minimalist twirl, but they're very realistic and beautifully made. So she's kind of, for me, she just had a show, not long ago, and she got great reception for it. And so I don't think that it's always, there is this little avant-garde, if that even exists anymore, which is pushing the envelope of what, we think is beautiful or great or good. And then I think, are artists like Catherine Murphy who incorporate so many things and give us so much that we need all at once. You don't get everything at once, but it's a very topic that interests me, of course. And I do think writing is very different, totally different. Also because we don't see it, it's temporal and we move through time with it, which I think makes it very difficult to make. I know when I make a drawing or a painting, to me, I see it. I can see the mistakes. I can see what I want to change. When you have a whole book, it's like it's inside your head.
Yeah, that's very true. And then there are some things evolve in literature that is more expansive. I don't think one thing necessarily supplants another, as it might seem to. Like once Andy Warhol came along and Rauschenberg and people who were doing that sort of art, then the other kind of art that Wolf Kahn was doing, for instance, it suddenly doesn't seem like art anymore. It seems like illustration or it seems like something different. Whereas with literature, say a new kind of memoir comes along, the memoir of crisis, where people who are not famous, just people who've had some misfortune, cancer, or been raped, or killed, or the parents are killed or something. So there's a new kind of memoir that's very slender. And that didn't really exist before. We would have like a memoir by a famous person.
Right. Yeah. Well, I would go on with this. I don't think that, let's say new art supplants something so much. I do think also often, things that are brand new look the oldest, the quickest to me. Because they get stamped a year and a date. So it brings us back. It would bring me back to the kind of book that you're writing and have written, or the book I'm working on, which does deal with past and present, deals with things that are, I don't know if I dare use the word classical, but, sort of structure and then emotion and all of those things, I think are existing at one time. I will say that, yeah, go on. I'm sorry, Joyce.
But I think when people read a book, they want to read something that is sincere and genuine. They don't want to read something that's a joke, a spoof, a parody of a novel. So the great task for the writer, whether experimental writer or realistic writer, is to present the world in such a way that the person can walk into it, like walking into a room or walking through a doorway and think, this is a real place. It's not just made up of it's not a house of cards that's going to fall apart or made of toothpicks or words, but is an actual place.
Yeah. It's funny, what you're describing also physically is what the high Renaissance artists wanted painting to be, to walk into the painting, literally like a window or a doorway. You walked into it, you broke through the canvas. And modern artists changed that idea, or
yes,
it was a different concept. But I agree with the book. It's very hard for me to read a book where I can't enter the world at all. And that doesn't mean, there are many different kind of books. I was thinking of what is it, Jenny Ophel, Weather, or Department of Speculation, which are written in these little, almost haiku-like things. But I love those books, I think they create a kind of thing in my head, that's so interesting.
It's like an interior.
Yeah. So I do think there's certainly room for all these different kind of things, but you do have to, I was going to say, be true to your school, which is an old rock and roll song. You have to create this world that then doesn't turn around somehow and betray the reader with irony. I always get annoyed by that,
Well, that's what people were doing in the 1950s. Like Nabokov is probably the best example. Yeah. Let's say John Barth. Now, it's very difficult to read John Barth because he was basically parodying the novel. He's parodying storytelling, or Donald Barthelme. It's like, it can be beautifully like prose poetry. At the same time, it's sort of like a joke. It's like he's rattling some aluminum or making some tin make some noise. It's like, don't believe this. It's not really, it's like a cartoon.
Well, it's funny because I was thinking of like The French Lieutenant's Woman, which is a book that I love. And then toward the end of that, he starts the main character, the protagonist is on the train with the main character, with the writer, and they're talking about it. And it was a very kind of conceptual thing, but he still kept you in that world. He still did it.
Well, he lived in Lyme Regis.
Yeah.
It was his actually house. Ray and I visited him there. So when but when Foles is evoking that world, like the wind and the sea and the Cornish, that is actually so real.
Yeah.
So the meta-fictional part of it is more like at the end. It's like
Yeah. I love John Foles, and The French Lieutenant's Woman was a little bit of a model for the last Mona Lisa. A little bit.
Really? I wouldn't know that.
Yeah, that and Possession, A.S. Byatt's book.
Well, that makes more sense.
Yeah, those books were in my head and I reread them, you know. And then, of course, I had to not think about them. But so, yeah. Oop.
Are we ending?
We're not ending. No, I could personally listen to both of you speak until you kick me out. But we do have quite a few questions from the audience. If you would just indulge us we have time for maybe 2 or 3.
Sure.
So here is a question from Jim. He says, I thoroughly enjoyed your wonderful book, The Last Mona Lisa. I'm enjoying the part of this interview where you are discussing forgery and copying of art. Is this concept part of the reason you selected Van Gogh as the subject of your sequel, a famous plagiarist or copier?
Gee, that's a great question. And thank you, Jim. I appreciate that very much. No, I didn't choose Van Gogh for that reason. You know, I think what happens to me is something chooses me. I started writing this book. I did not know Van Gogh would come into this book. And then he made an entrance. And then I guess I'm a somewhat obsessive personality. And then I started following that. And then I read this, you know, whatever 900-page biography that I recommend to everyone because it reads like the greatest novel. And so, you know, no, it just, that idea of forgery, I will say, because of, you know, what I've done with art in my life, is something that totally fascinates me. It just totally, the mentality of it. And there is a little bit of that in this new novel, yes. But I don't want to tell you that because it'll be a big spoiler, I think, you know, so.
We do not want that. We want people to buy that book as well.
Yeah, not finished, but have faith.
Yes. And a reminder, a link to The Last Mona Lisa is in the chat, a link to our bookseller and independent bookseller. And they also have all of Joyce's books, of course. A question from John. Jonathan mentioned his drawing consists of various marks that make up a nose. Did Leonardo also believe his paintings consisted of marks or forms such as, for example, a triangle?
Wow. I would say this, because I can't get inside Leonardo's mind, even though there are all of his notebooks, you know, in which he wrote about experiments and work. I would say that he was, and Joyce said this before, Leonardo is a very analytical mind. And so I think, and when I look at his paintings, there's a great painting in the Uffizi, the Adoration of the Magi. It's unfinished. And what's great about it is you can see how Leonardo thinks. Half of it's finished, half of it's not. This part is this is all just drawing. So I do think, yes, Leonardo probably did think of his work in many ways. You know, I mean, he was a Renaissance artist, so he wanted to create a world that they were all interested in, beauty and walking into it. But I think he really knew about taking parts and structuring and how a mark built up in a painting. If you think of the Mona Lisa, it was built up with small layers of washes, of glazes over years of work on top of each other. What was called sfumato, smoke in Italian. These layers of paint.
And was there a drawing underneath it?
Oh, they've X-rayed it. There's
you would think so.
Yeah.
What about Van Gogh? Van Gogh doesn't have that?
No, Van Gogh did do sometimes drawings of the same things that he painted, but his paintings are very direct. And in fact, if you look at most, not all, but a lot of Van Gogh paintings, the canvas is showing through. In other words, there's all these marks and this incredible emotion of the moment, which
and what about the portraits? Are they the same technique?
They're more built up, but you know, I just came back from Amsterdam and looking at all of those paintings, you know, there's a whole room of his self-portraits that change a lot over the years, because he was allowed himself to be influenced, you know. I mean, he did all those dark paintings and the peasant paintings, and then he came to Paris and he met, you know, became friends with Pissarro and Emile Bernard, a young artist, and Toulouse-Lautrec, and he let them invade his work, his mentality, you know. So, and boy, if there's anybody who's about the mark, it's Van Gogh. I mean, you just look at those paintings and, you know, every part of the face is built out of strokes of pigment. You know,
really, that's true. Yeah, I'm sure if you turn it upside down, you know, it might not look like a face.
Well, you know, we used to do that in art school, Joyce, all the time. Our painting teachers would tell us to turn our paintings upside down to see if we were balancing it correctly. You know?
Well, you know, we can't recognize faces if they're upside down. Like a photograph of some friend of yours whom you know very well, if it's turned upside down, it's very hard to recognize it. That's the way our brains are.
Yeah. I always think it's interesting that you can often recognize your friends from the back, because there's something about their gestalt, you know, their thing, their presence, you know, that's beyond their face, of course. So,
are there any other questions?
I think that is it. I think I'm going to leave it at this is a perfect stopping point. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you so much, Joyce. This was a truly wonderful and all-encompassing conversation, I feel like. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you to our literary committee, especially Phoebe Hoban, who made this event possible in the first place. So thank you, Phoebe. And again, thank you to both of you. And please come back to the National Arts Club. We are in person. So I hope to see both you and Jonathan and Joyce come and see us. We'll love to invite you. And
we will both be happy to come for dinner sometime.
Great. I will love to treat you.
You have a wonderful It's a wonderful.
I do want to thank Phoebe for initiating this and inviting me. It was so kind and thoughtful of her. And for Joyce for doing this. And I did want to just quickly say, when Joyce says a kind of fever experience or experiencing a world, her last, I think it's the last published book, Breathe, I recommend to not just to readers, but to writers who want to see how you create a world, you know? So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for having us.